In Dalton Falls, Georgia, a quiet town stitched together with church picnics, little league games, and polite nods across grocery aisles, people still believe they know their neighbors. That's what makes stories like this so unsettling. Make sure to watch this video to the very end, cause what the teacher wife did was unbelievable. If this story moves you, give the video a like. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you will never miss an upload. Now, let's dive into the story. Noah Harper was one of those people everyone seemed to like. A high school history teacher, war veteran and proud husband. He gave lectures that made students care about wars they'd never heard of and spent his weekends coaching JV basketball. But one early spring morning, he didn't show up to school. And when they found him, cold in bed, eyes open, the flag he once saluted folded neatly beside his photo, everyone believed it was just a tragic heart attack. Everyone except for one man, a friend, a fellow veteran. Someone who'd seen fear in the eyes of dying men before, and saw it again in Noah's lifeless stare. That one observation cracked everything open, and what spilled out was a story so haunting, so tangled in desperation, that even the most seasoned detectives question where the line between love and delusion truly ends. This isn't just a murder case. It's a portrait of loneliness, of a wife unseen, of temptation wrapped in digital connection, and of a small-town tragedy fueled by the kind of secrets that don't stay buried. Stay with us. What you're about to hear is real. Elizabeth Harper was born in Dalton Falls and had never lived anywhere else. Most folks knew her simply as Ellie. She had soft, pale features, kept her chestnut hair in a loose bun, and always wore earth-tone cardigans no matter the season. Her house on Willow Grove Lane was modest. Faded yellow siding, a front porch crowded with terracotta pots, and a swing that never quite stopped creaking in the wind. People would pass by and see her out there trimming roses or wiping dust off the window ledges. She'd smile politely, a little wave, never much more than that. To outsiders, she was a kind of woman you wouldn't expect to make waves. She was married young, just 22, to Noah Harper, who was nearly 10 years older. Back then, he was already a fixture at the local high school, and Ellie was just finishing up her community college courses in early childhood education. They seemed like a sweet couple. Mismatched, maybe, but balanced. Their wedding was small. Backyard reception, string lights, chocolate sheet cake. Ellie wore her mother's veil. Noah wore his military dress blues. From the outside, their life looked ordinary. But behind the curtains of that yellow house, something was off. Noah had returned from his second tour overseas quieter than before. He was never cruel, never violent, but emotionally absent. There were days when he barely spoke, and less spoken to. He watched the evening news with a beer in hand, went to bed early, and often forgot their anniversary. Ellie at first tried to understand. She kept the house spotless, left notes in his lunch bag, lit candles at dinner. But slowly, she began to feel like a ghost in her own home. The silence between them grew louder than words ever could. She once told her friend from church, "It's like living with someone who's already gone, but whose body never left." By the time she turned 30, Ellie had stopped going out much. Her social media presence was a digital scrapbook of plants, floral teas, and garden quotes. No selfies, no couple photos, just blossoms, thorns hidden. Behind every photo of blooming lilies and violet tulips was a woman quietly unraveling. She wasn't unhappy in a dramatic sense. There were no fights to speak of, no scandal. But she was lonely in a way that settled deep in the marrow, a chronic ache. And like many before her, she looked for something to fill the silence. Something or someone. Ellie Harper didn't set out to meet anyone. That's what she told herself. She created an Instagram account one quiet Sunday afternoon while sipping lavender tea. She followed gardening pages, accounts that share quotes about peace, growth, and healing. Her first post was a photo of her rose bush with the caption, "She blooms, even after frost." It received 2 likes. Then, days later, a comment appeared. At Tessa Riley _ your roses are stunning. Reminds me of my grandma's garden, Purple Heart. Tessa Riley. At the time, she was 19, a waitress at a roadside diner in a town called Covington, just an hour's drive from Dalton Falls. She posted mirror selfies with bold eyeliner, reels of her dancing in her room, and snapshots of iced coffee and thrifted books. Her account radiated youth. Chaos. Color. Ellie hesitated, but she replied, "Thank you. I'm trying to revive them. They've been neglected for a while." Tessa replied instantly, "They still look beautiful. Neglect doesn't kill beauty. It just hides it." That message struck Ellie like a match against dry bark. What began as an innocent exchange turned into a daily thread of messages. Garden tips became personal stories. Late-night chats turned into voice notes. Tessa's voice was bubbly, unfiltered. Ellie's responses were quieter, more thoughtful, but slowly, her walls began to crack. Tessa would say things like, "You remind me of those romantic poets," and "Your energy is so calming," like, "Oh, so calming." And Ellie? She began smiling again, laughing quietly at her phone in the mornings. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a wife, not as a background figure in someone else's life, but as a woman, complex, full of ache and hope. Tessa asked real questions. What do you dream about? Did you always want to live here? What do you wish people knew about you? They shared secrets. Ellie confessed she sometimes stood in the backyard barefoot at night, just to feel something. Tessa admitted she hated her job, hated being underestimated, hated how the world tried to box her in. They spoke about books, music, regrets. Tessa shared that her mother had struggled with depression. Ellie opened up about Noah's silence, how it was his fault, but how it still hurt. This digital thread between them became sacred, their own invisible world. Tessa suggested meeting in person. "I'll be near Dalton for a pickup shift at the diner off Route 73, she said. "Want to grab coffee?" Ellie almost said no, almost deleted the message. But instead, she said yes. They met at a place called Hatter's Cafe, half bakery, half antique store. Ellie wore a navy sweater and a scarf that smelled faintly of rosemary. Tessa wore a leather jacket, chipped purple nail polish, and a grin that disarmed every part of Ellie's hesitation. Their conversation was effortless. Laughter came easily. Tessa leaned in when she spoke, her eyes bright, her energy electric. When Ellie returned home that night, Noah was already asleep. She stood in the hallway for a long time, coat still on, phone still in her hand. She didn't know what she felt, excitement, guilt, confusion. But she knew one thing for sure. That afternoon had felt more real than the last 5 years of her life. From then on, the meetings continued. A lunch here, a walk through the park there. Then longer visits, parking lots, diner booths at midnight, back seats. Tessa brought little gifts, a bracelet with a moon charm, rose lip balm, hand-drawn sketches on coffee-stained napkins. She told Ellie she was beautiful in ways no one had before, and Ellie believed her. She was nearly 20 years older, but with Tessa, she felt radiant, desired, like the protagonist of a story that had finally begun, but there was always an edge, a risk, because for all the tenderness, it was still a secret, a relationship built in the dark, carried in whispered calls and locked phones. Tessa once asked, "What would life look like if it were just us?" And Ellie didn't answer, not because she hadn't thought about it, but because she had. In the soft hush of southern evenings, under pink skies and cicada songs, Ellie Harper found herself waiting for someone who wasn't her husband. Tessa. She'd parked 2 streets down, engine humming low, Windows cracked, music playing, something dreamy and slow. Ellie would slip out quietly, saying she was going for a walk. Sometimes she carried a trowel and gloves just in case Noah looked up from his armchair. Sometimes he didn't even notice. They met in the backs of parked cars at the edge of town behind old diners with flickering signs. At first, it was just conversation. Then hands touched. Then lips. It wasn't planned. It never is. Tessa kissed with purpose, unapologetic, assured. She made Ellie feel like she was allowed to take up space. Like she wasn't just a shadow behind a decorated veteran, but a woman still full of fire. Ellie's world split in two. By day, she clipped rose stems and folded Noah's laundry. By night, she was texting poetry, receiving heart emojis, and sharing stories she'd never said out loud before. Tessa didn't just listen, she adored. She'd say things like, "You're wasted in that house," and "If I had you, I'd never let you go unnoticed." Ellie wanted to believe her. Maybe she did. But the guilt crept in like water under a door. She'd stand in her kitchen at night staring at Noah, reading, silent, present in body but distant in soul, and wonder, is it cheating if your heart has already left? One night, Ellie stayed out too late. Noah was waiting. He asked if everything was okay. She lied. He didn't push. He never did. And that was the problem. He had returned from Afghanistan with scars he didn't talk about. PTSD, the VA had said. But Ellie didn't want a diagnosis. She wanted a husband, someone who saw her. Noah loved her. She knew that, but it was a love soaked in silence, buried beneath duty, sleep, and routine. Tessa, on the other hand, was loud, messy, chaotic, alive. And Ellie had started craving that chaos more than she feared the consequences. Then came the first suggestion. Tessa said it on a Tuesday night, after a long kiss in the car. She rested her forehead on Ellie's and whispered, "What would it look like if it were just us?" Not a joke, not a dream, a possibility. Ellie didn't say no. She didn't say anything at all. But later that night, lie beside a man who'd once held her through panic attacks and long hospital nights, she thought about a world where she didn't have to pretend anymore. A world without this house, without these silences, without Noah. It terrified her, and it thrilled her. The next week, Ellie went to visit her Aunt Judith May. She brought Tessa. Aunt Judith was unlike anyone else in the family, a former nurse turned backwood herbalist. She lived alone in a farmhouse filled with tinctures, pressed flowers, and books on plants people have forgotten how to use. She served the milk tea and looked at Tessa with curiosity, then at Ellie with quiet understanding. Ellie didn't say much. She didn't have to. Judith watched her niece closely, then said, simply, "You look like a woman holding a grenade with a pin already pulled." Tessa chuckled. Ellie didn't. The old woman leaned forward, her voice low. "Tell me what you want, not what you're scared of." It was during that visit, over steaming cups of tea, that the idea began to root. A plan masked as freedom, a desire cloaked in justification. They spoke in hints at first, about peace, release, how people change. Judith never used the word kill. She called it mercy. She called it setting someone free. And Ellie, desperate and drowning in a love that felt like oxygen, started to believe it. Started to believe she could bloom again, but only after something else withered. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing ever does. Plans like these don't scream, they whisper. They tiptoe in through half-joking comments, through long silences over teacups, through unspoken glances that carry centuries of unmet needs. For Ellie Harper, the shift from dream to decision happened sometime between a sleepless night and a Sunday morning text from Tessa that simply read, "I'd do anything for you." Judith May's farmhouse became a quiet headquarters. The shelves lined with jars, rosemary, lavender, valerian, took on new meaning. But there was one jar, pushed back behind the others, labeled in delicate cursive, digitalis. Foxglove, a beautiful killer. Ellie had seen it before, in her gardening books, in her own backyard even. It grew tall, bell-shaped, purple and pink like innocence itself. But in high doses, its poison could stop a heart clean. Judith explained it softly, like teaching someone to bake. Too much too quickly? Suspicious. But a little over time? Untraceable. Almost. So they started with tea. At first, chamomile. Harmless. Then Judith taught Ellie to brew a calming blend. Chamomile, lemon balm, and just the smallest drop of foxglove infusion. A test. The plan wasn't rushed. It was brewed slowly, like the tea itself. Day by day, Ellie would prepare Noah's evening cup. Noah, ever the routine man, welcomed the gesture. "You're taking such good care of me lately," he said, smiling faintly. She smiled back and stirred. By day 4, Noah started to feel it. He rubbed his chest and said he was tired. Claimed it was the humidity, maybe his age. He even made a doctor's appointment, but Judith assured Ellie, he won't make it to the waiting room. On the 5th night, he looked worse. Sweaty, pale, but he kissed her forehead and went to bed early, mumbling something about needing rest. Ellie stood outside their bedroom door for 10 minutes, frozen. Inside, the man who once read her poetry and held her hand through her mother's funeral was dying, and she had made it so. Noah Harper died in his sleep that night. The death certificate, signed the next morning, read, "Cardiac arrest, probable cause unknown. A veteran, a teacher, a man with no prior heart history." But no one questioned it. Not yet. Ellie wept at the funeral, held her husband's folded military flag, accepted casseroles from neighbors. And when it was over, when the last car pulled away and the last prayer was whispered, she sat alone in the backyard. Tessa arrived later, barefoot, eyes red. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Ellie said, "It's done." Tessa whispered, "You're free." But as the sun dipped behind the trees, Ellie felt something strange. Not guilt, not grief. Something heavier. Something like silence, louder than it had ever been. A few days later, Ellie returned to Judith's farmhouse to thank her. The old woman, ever calm, handed her a small bouquet of foxglove and roses. "Don't plant these two close together," Judith said, smiling. "One feeds, the other kills." Ellie took the flowers and placed them in a vase by Noah's old reading chair. She stared at them for a long time, because somewhere inside her she knew she hadn't buried the past. She had just planted something darker in its place. The town of Dalton Falls had seen its share of sorrow, accidents, drownings, the occasional quiet overdose, but nothing ever seemed to fracture the place, until Noah Harper's funeral. The service was held at the First Baptist Church on Main, a familiar place, where Noah once led Veterans Day assemblies and taught summer school to kids with nowhere else to go. The sanctuary was packed. Former students, fellow teachers, parents, vets. They came not just to mourn, but to remember a man who'd quietly held up a community. Ellie sat in the front row, a black veil pulled just low enough to hide her face. Tessa wasn't there. Judith wasn't either. It was just Ellie and the weight of what she'd done, though no one around her knew. She cried when the honor guard folded the American flag. She sobbed when they handed it to her, placing it gently in her lap like an eternal question. And when Coach Tim stepped to the podium to share memories of his friend, his voice broke, not out of grief but confusion. Noah wasn't just a good man. He was sharp, calm under pressure, never complained. But that night, when I saw him at the hospital, he didn't look like a man dying of heart failure. He looked scared. His eyes, they were wide open, like he knew something wasn't right. People shifted in their pews. A few nodded along. Others exchanged glances. No one wanted to say it. Not then, not during the eulogy, but Tim had cracked open a possibility, one that Ellie had hoped would stay buried. Narrator. Then came the complication no one expected, because Noah Harper wasn't just a teacher or a veteran or a husband. He was a soldier with military insurance. And military insurance required toxicology on all unnatural deaths, especially for those under 50. The doctors had missed it, but the lab didn't. 2 weeks after the funeral, the report arrived at the Dalton County Sheriff's Office. Findings: elevated levels of digitoxin in the bloodstream. Source: likely ingestion. Consistent with foxglove poisoning. The case was reclassified. Not natural. Suspicious. The detectives paid Ellie a visit. She offered tea. They declined. They asked about Noah's health history. She said he'd been feeling tired, that he hadn't slept well, that maybe it was just his heart, finally giving out. But their questions grew more pointed. Did he take any medication? Was he depressed? Did he ever talk about death? She gave polite, quiet answers. But behind her smile, the ground began to shift. That same night, they pulled his medical records. No prior heart issues. Stable blood pressure. Good cholesterol. A full physical a year before it cleared him for another Army Reserve contract. There was no explanation for a sudden collapse. Except one. Poison. The kind found in flowers. Dalton Falls wasn't ready for a murder scandal. But gossip travels fast in small towns. By the time the local news got wind of it, Ellie had already retreated indoors, closing her curtains and ignoring knocks. She didn't answer calls, not even from Tessa, not even from Judith. And when detectives returned with a warrant, it wasn't the tea leaves that gave her away. It was what they found under her fingernails. Residue, small but present, of digitalis leaf matter. The same kind Judith used in her herbal mixtures. The same kind that, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. The next morning, Ellie stood in her garden, pruning the roses she'd once tended with love. 2 detectives approached from the driveway. She didn't flinch, didn't run, just placed the shears gently on the soil, and said quietly, "Do you have a warrant?" They did, and she went with them, calmly, her black glove still in her apron pocket. Inside, the vase with foxglove still stood. The flowers were beginning to wilt, but their secret had already bloomed. The arrest of Elizabeth Harper sent Dalton Falls into shock. Whispers turned into headlines. That gentle woman in the garden? The teacher's quiet wife? Accused of murder? People wanted answers. Reporters wanted a story. But the truth, the full truth, was far more tangled than the town could imagine. What the police found next wasn't just motive. It was a digital trail soaked in heartbreak, obsession, and betrayal. On the evening of her arrest, Ellie refused to speak without her attorney. But her phone didn't need a lawyer. It spoke volumes. With a warrant in hand, investigators extracted over 4,000 text messages from Ellie's private messaging apps. Voice notes, photos, saved Instagram DMs, even a few encrypted backups. All between Ellie and Tessa Riley. We expected emotional content. We didn't expect a blueprint. The text started innocent. Lavender fields. Compliments. You're so kind. I love how you see the world. But then things shifted. Tessa, do you ever wish you could just disappear? Ellie, every day. Tessa, if it were just us, I think we'd be safe. Ellie, I think I'd feel alive. Tessa, then why not make it real? The conversations turned darker. Fear became fantasy. Fantasy became planning. Photos of herbal mixtures. Lists of symptoms. A bookmark page titled, plants that can kill silently, screenshots of Noah's medication bottles, discussion of timing, dosage, disguise. In one audio message, Ellie whispered, "If he doesn't wake up, no one will be surprised. They'll think it was just his heart. He's tired all the time. They'll believe it." The FBI was brought in. Digital forensics confirmed the timestamps, the IP locations, even the deleted messages that Ellie thought were gone. The evidence was overwhelming, but they still needed the other piece of the puzzle. Tessa Riley. And Tessa was gone. When officers visited her small apartment in Milford, they found it abandoned. Mail stacked at the door, food rotting inside. Neighbors hadn't seen her in a week. They traced her last known login to a motel just outside Savannah. When agents arrived, they found her registered under a false name. She didn't run. She didn't fight. Tessa Riley, just 20 years old, stood quietly in the hallway of room 204 and asked, "Is she okay?" Under questioning, Tessa broke. Within 2 hours, she confessed to everything. But her version of the story was different. She claimed she never intended for Noah to die, that the talk of poison was drama, a game, like writing fantasy together, that Ellie had taken it too far. But the evidence didn't support innocence. One message from Tessa read, "Don't lose your nerve. He's already halfway gone. This isn't murder. It's mercy. He doesn't see you." And then came Judith May, the missing puzzle piece. She wasn't arrested. She walked into the station herself, a paisley scarf around her head, a tote bag full of gardening books. She smiled as she sat down and said, "I know why you're here. I didn't poison anyone. I just gave her the plants. What she did with them, well, that was her journey. But I don't regret helping. He was already dead inside. All I did was hand her a door. The interviews, the messages, the evidence, all pointed to a coordinated plan, a shared delusion between 3 women, each convinced they were doing the right thing. Love, escape, freedom. But the law didn't see poetry. It saw premeditation. And the trial was about to begin. The trial of Elizabeth Harper drew national attention. News vans lined up outside the Dalton County Courthouse. True crime podcasts ran special coverage. And in the gallery, townsfolk sat shoulder to shoulder, some in quiet support, others in open disbelief. The woman who once pruned roses in silence was now center stage in a courtroom drama that didn't feel real. The charge, first-degree murder. The motive? That was what both sides would fight to define. Ellie sat at the defendant's table, flanked by her public defender and a private psychological consultant. Her hair had gone noticeably grayer. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady, calm in a way that unnerved even the prosecution. Tessa Riley would testify. So would Judith May. And so would Noah's closest friends. The jury was about to be shown 2 versions of Elizabeth Harper, one painted in romance, the other in premeditated blood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this was not a woman pushed to desperation. This was a woman who planned, who experimented, who lied. She didn't want freedom. She wanted Tessa, and she was willing to kill for it. The prosecution presented a meticulous timeline, text calls, and chemical evidence. They introduced a foxglove trace in Noah's bloodstream, showed the jury how digital conversations described dosages, how Judith had delivered herbs without question. They emphasized motive, a craving for love, for youth, for escape. In one chilling piece of evidence, Ellie had messaged Tessa, "When this is over, I'll be yours. Not in the shadows, not with secrets. I promise." They played the audio twice. The jury didn't flinch. Then it was the defense's turn. Their argument didn't deny the death, but they reframed the intention. Ellie, they said, had been emotionally abused for years. That Noah's silence wasn't passive. It was controlling, that she lived in a house that felt like a coffin, that she never meant to kill, only to numb her pain. She wasn't evil. She was empty. Years of isolation made her desperate. And Tessa? Tessa was the only person who ever looked her in the eyes and saw a woman worth hearing. Tessa's testimony was complicated. She wept on the stand, described Ellie as warm, lonely, obsessed. She admitted to dreaming of a life together, of running away, but claimed she never truly believed Ellie would go through with it. Her final words lingered in the courtroom. I didn't kill Noah, but I didn't stop it either. Judith May's appearance was something else entirely. Dressed in bright colors, she showed no remorse. She spoke poetically about plants, death, and rebirth. She told the court, every woman deserves a window. I gave her a shovel. No one was sure if she meant that metaphorically. After 10 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 7 hours. On day 11, they returned. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Elizabeth Harper, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps, cries, silence. She showed no reaction. The sentence, life in prison without parole. Judith May received 15 years for accessory to murder and conspiracy. She waved to the cameras as she was escorted out. Tessa Riley, having just turned 20, was found guilty of conspiracy. But due to her age and testimony, the judge sentenced her to 5 years in psychiatric rehabilitation with mandatory memoir writing therapy component. The courtroom was drained. The media lit up, and the town of Dalton Falls would never look at gardening or quiet women the same way again. The gavel had fallen. The trial was over. But the story didn't end when the courtroom emptied. For some, life after crime meant freedom. For others, it meant learning to breathe inside a cage. And for one man's family, it meant learning how to live with questions that would never be answered. Elizabeth Harper was transferred to Julia Tutwiler Women's Prison, just over the Alabama state line. There, she became inmate 114729. In the early weeks, she barely spoke, refused visits, kept to herself, but then she began to write. Not letters, not apologies, poetry, simple, strange poems, mostly about roses, about silence, about the way things bloom in the dark and never get seen. One was reportedly titled, Foxglove Doesn't Ask Permission. Another read, He stopped listening long before I stopped speaking. The prison library has a binder of her work. Inmates say it circulates more than the Bible. Judith May, ever the rebel, taught a botany class behind bars. Prison staff reported she'd sneak herbal lessons into casual conversation. A guard once overheard her say, chamomile can calm the nerves. Foxglove can calm a heart permanently. She will be eligible for parole in 12 years. Some say she's writing a book. Others say she's already mailed it to a publisher under a fake name. No one knows for sure. Tessa Riley's journey took a different route. She spent 18 months in a secure psychiatric center. There, she underwent intensive therapy, group rehabilitation, and a creative recovery program. Under supervision, she began writing a memoir, tentatively titled, The Quiet One Smiled First. It charts a relationship with Ellie from garden photos to grave consequences. Early drafts describe Ellie as both a sanctuary and storm. Today, Tessa lives under a new name in a small Pacific Northwest town. She's not allowed on social media, but she volunteers at a domestic violence shelter, speaking anonymously to young girls about boundary loss and emotional manipulation. She's only 23. As for Noah Harper, his story doesn't end with death. Noah's brother, a former Marine named David Harper, started the Harper Foundation for Spouses of Veterans, a nonprofit providing therapy and community for partners struggling with PTSD-related emotional isolation in their relationships. The foundation has already helped over 500 families. In one interview, David said, "My brother came back from war, but never fully returned. If we had known what to look for, maybe we wouldn't be building something from his grave." A bronze plaque of Noah, in his military uniform, now hangs outside Dalton Falls High School's history wing. Students leave flowers. Veterans leave medals. Dalton Falls itself changed, too. The house on Willow Grove Lane, where Ellie once trimmed roses, now stands empty, its windows boarded up. The garden is overgrown, the roses wild, unchecked. Some kids say you can still smell tea in the air. Others say the silence there hums. This wasn't just the story of a murder. This was the story of unspoken things, of quiet desperation, of how love, when twisted by silence and secrecy, can turn lethal. Ellie Harper didn't look like a monster. That's what made it easier for her to become one. We ask, how many people walk past you every day, slowly falling apart behind a smile? How many people you think are gentle, are secretly drowning? And how close could any of us come to making the same choices? If just one person saw us, truly saw us, too late. Tell us what you think in the comments. Would you have seen the signs? Do you believe love can ever justify destruction? Subscribe for more faceless storytelling that brings the truth to light. Like this video if you believe stories can change lives. Stay safe, stay aware, and always question the quiet ones.